Hello, and welcome to Generational Ministries. I'm your host, Sandra Fitzgerald, and the title of today's short story is The Empty Chair. Here we go. Then Jonathan said to David, "Tomorrow is the new moon, and you shall be missed because your seat will be empty." And the king sat upon a seat by the wall. And Jonathan arose, and Abner sat by Saul's side, and David's place was empty. And it came to pass on the morrow, which was the second day of the month, that David's place was empty. By now we should be aware that the short story is about loss, the kind of loss we experience when relationships are broken. The reasons vary from one thing to another. It may be a death, a runaway child, a divorce, child goes off to college or get married, leaving an empty nest, or perhaps an angry dispute put a rent in the relationship. Whatever the reason for the separation, it all comes down to this: there's an empty chair at the table. In the introduction, we are referring to a time when David's place was empty at the palace of King Saul. By now, David is Saul's personal musician. Also, by now, David's fame had outgrown Saul's, and Saul was intent on getting rid of David by any means necessary. In spite of all Saul's animosity against David, a true friendship had developed between Saul's son Jonathan and Saul's enemy David. By now, Jonathan has come to realize that if David remains in the palace, his very life will be in jeopardy. Therefore, Jonathan made a pact with David to forever have peace between each other's children. 1 Samuel 21 and 42 finds David having to say goodbye to his friend and go underground, so to speak, in hiding from Saul. When all was said and done, every time Jonathan looked over at David's place at the table, his seat was empty. Do we have seats in our lives that are empty due to drama that unfolds when there's strife among us? How many chairs are empty at our table because we have run someone off with harsh words of malice and have abused them to the point that they couldn't stay? How many chairs will have to be empty at our table before we realize that it's not our place to change others? Many other people we run off aggravate us because they possess qualities that we would like to have ourselves. And out of envy and malice, we harass and pick on them and antagonize them to the point where they have to get away for their own peace of mind and personal safety. Saul was angry because he could see David taking his place. He was aware of the fact that not only God favored David, but the people did as well. Even his own son loved David. This was too much for Saul, and after David's fame began to outrank his, he tried to kill David by sticking him to the wall with his javelin. David had no choice but to hit the road. There are several accounts in the Bible of empty chairs for one reason or another. Let's explore some of them. We'll go back as far as the first family and see whose seat is empty at Adam and Eve's table. Their son Abel's chair is empty. Why? Jealousy and anger drove his brother Cain to madness, and in his rage, he killed Abel. To lose someone to death is a painful thing, but to lose a child is an exquisite pain. Only the one who has experienced it can feel it. Our children are killed by gunshot wounds, car accidents, self-inflicted damage, fire, and other natural causes. No matter how they die, it's a war across the world or 2 miles from our home. The simple fact is that chair is empty, never to be occupied again. Our child is gone. Did we say that Abel's chair was empty? It was, the story goes on in the book of Genesis, until Cain's seat is empty as well. As punishment for killing his brother Abel, Cain is sentenced to a life on the run as a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. Genesis 4:12 says Cain tells God in the next verse that his punishment is too hard, more than he could bear even. Yet when all is said and done, Cain's chair is empty as well from the table of Adam and Eve. Still in the book of Genesis, Father Abraham finds himself gazing at an empty chair in his tent. Who is missing, we ask. If we look close, we can see it's his firstborn son, Ishmael. Ishmael had no crime like Cain. The only thing Ishmael had done was to be born at the wrong time to the wrong woman. Abraham had been promised a son by God, and after several years went by with no sign of the child, his wife Sarah takes it upon herself to help God out by having her maid Hagar bear Abraham's child that she could claim as her own. Well, the plan worked perfectly. The only problem was this: Ishmael was Abraham and Hagar's child, not Abraham and Sarah's child as she had planned. And to stir up the mix, Sarah goes on to have Isaac about 13 years later. Now what will happen to Ishmael? His mother had already put herself on Sarah's hit list when she had him. Instead of being submissive, Hagar showed her true colors. She was a sister from Upper Egypt. And ladies, you know how a sister can be. Once she had that baby, she thought she had the man. Well, just like that's not always the case today, it was not the case back then either. Abraham has a choice to make. Either the child of the promise or the child of the flesh. He had to choose. When all was said and done, Genesis 21:14 find Abraham packing Ishmael and Hagar off and sending them away. Ishmael's chair was empty. Today, there are those of us who have children from a previous marriage or a relationship, and just like Abraham, sometimes we have to make a decision. Do we stay with the child's other parent, knowing that there will be continued strife, or do we let go, then move on? This is a terrible and a hard choice to make. And just like Ishmael, the child who didn't ask to be here gets caught in the middle. Any way we slice it up, a chair will be empty. We need to pick our mates wisely. The only way to do this is by scriptural knowledge of right and wrong choices. Too many chairs are empty, belonging to divorced parents and out-of-wedlock couples. So we don't want that. We want to choose our partners wisely and take time to get to know each other. And hopefully that love will last and you won't have so many problems. Okay, moving on to Abraham's son Isaac. He too has a chair missing from his table. Who does it belong to? It's Isaac's son Jacob. Genesis chapter 25 tells us that Isaac took a wife named Rebekah when he was 40 years old. She became pregnant with twins. 2 nations, the Lord told her. One nation would be stronger than the other, and the younger would rule over the older. Sure enough, as the children grew, Jacob was more cunning of mind than his older brother Esau, who was a hunter. One day when Esau came in from the hunt, Jacob was making a stew. Now Esau was very hungry. I'm assuming he didn't get anything that day. And so he was so hungry he sold his birthright for a bowl of the stew that his brothers were cooking. Time passes, and Isaac is old and ready to die. But before he dies, he has to give the blessing to the oldest child. Rebekah and Jacob tricks Isaac into thinking that Jacob is the oldest, by dressing him to feel like Esau, who was very hairy. They succeeded in their plan, and now the younger is the ruler over the eldest, just like God had predicted. Jacob had the birthright and the blessing that was to be Esau's. Where's the empty chair, you ask? Verse 41 of chapter 27 finds Esau planning to kill Jacob for his trickery, and verse 43 finds Jacob preparing to hit the road to escape from his brother Esau's wrath. His chair at Rebekah's table remains empty for about 20 years. Well, what goes around comes around, as the saying goes. Jacob now has a seat empty at his table. In time, after he left Esau, he has 12 sons. One of them comes up missing. His name is Joseph. Joseph, being born to Jacob by his beloved Rachel in his old age, is Jacob's favorite son. He loved Joseph more than he loved all the rest. What a recipe for disaster. Unable to overcome their resentment at their father, the other sons, with the exception of Benjamin, Rachel's youngest child, set out to get rid of Joseph. Their first thought was to kill him, but brother Reuben prevented this by reminding them that they would have innocent blood on their hands. So they sold him to some Ishmaelites instead. Jacob would watch Joseph's empty chair for many, many years to come. Many would be the day he would mourn the loss of something precious being taken away from him. Remember how he did Esau? Let's move on up to the book of Exodus and check out one of Joseph's descendants by the name of Moses. There are 2 chairs empty where Moses should be sitting. One is from a priestly family of the house of Levi. His mother was forced to hide Moses in the Nile River to escape the wrath of Pharaoh, who was intent on killing all the Hebrew boys in order to cull the population of Israelites. This woman's child is gone. Ironically, Pharaoh's daughter rescues Moses, and in Exodus 2:10, she names him and she raises him as her very own son. Her table is soon to have an empty chair at it also. Moses, no doubt feeling a call in his life to be a deliverer, kills an Egyptian in defense of a Hebrew because they were his people. Once the matter is made known, Moses hit the road in fear of Pharaoh's wrath. He acted out of season, and in his rash actions left an empty chair at his mother's table. We too have seen empty chairs, where a young minister has heard the call of God on their life and struck out too soon and left a vacant spot behind what they should still be in, learning and growing, and making sure that what they're doing bears fruit. You can't go out too soon because what you're doing won't last. So that chair is empty, but it should still be filled with that little preacher or that little minister learning and growing from the elders around him. How many mothers and fathers have sat and watched the empty chair of a hard-headed child? Stubborn rebellion has taken them away. They took a trip with sin and never came home again. Maybe they thought they could handle drugs. Maybe it was a few bills that caused the car accident that ended their life and left that chair empty. Or perhaps they got involved with the wrong crowd. Whatever the reason, sin took them farther than they planned on going and kept them there longer than they planned on staying. Consider the story of the prodigal son. You can read about him in Luke 15, verses 11 through 32. It's good reading. Read that sometime. But to get back to our story about hard-headed children, such was the case with Samson. Now Samson had a roving eye that got him into trouble with women. His parents had warned him in Judges 14:3 to get him a wife from among his own people, the Israelites. But Samson decided to do a cultural change. He wanted a Philistine woman. This is not always a wise move. For Samson, it proved fatal. Having made it through 2 bad choices, the third one did him in. Delilah was her name, and Gold Digger was her game. She was paid to bring Samson down. Samson was a man of supernatural strength that lay in his covenant with God for a razor never to touch his head. Delilah got that secret out of him and left him vulnerable and exposed, and ultimately Samson's taste in women brought him to his death and left his chair empty at his parents' table. Sometimes we have to make a wise choice. Sometimes the cultural choices we make in other people, if we haven't studied it out and thought about it and got to know not only her and him, but their family as well, you are making a bad choice, and you don't want that for your life. Make sure you know everybody really well before you get into a family, because you don't want it to go bad. You don't want it to go bad. So get to know your future partner and then marry for love, not looks. Okay? Moving on to the chairs left empty by divorce. Looking at that chair reminds us of many different things. For some, it reminds us of good times and fun family days. For some, it is a reminder of betrayal and broken promises. For others, the chair that is empty reminds us of how hard we have to work now. For others, it's a reminder of bondage, and the chair is left on display to recall the chains of abuse, so the mistake of marrying Mr. and Mrs. Wrong will not be repeated. In the book of Esther, King Ahasuerus gazes at a chair that is left as empty as a result of divorce. He bitterly regrets his foolish actions, having left the seat at his table vacant. It is the beautiful Vashti that used to grace his table, but now she's gone, having listened to his so-called wise men. He had Vashti dethroned for her refusal to entertain him and his drunken friends at a party. Now he's left with her empty chair, no queen to remind him that he took his good thing for granted. Proverbs 18:22 goes on to say, "He that finds a wife finds a good thing." Husbands and wives both should remember the saying, as it can apply to both. Don't take a good spouse for granted. One day we may be staring at an empty chair if we do. Okay, so we have talked about empty chairs left by death of our children. But what about the death of our brothers and sisters? Like when Martha and Mary lost Lazarus to death. Now, it is a painful thing to lose a sibling to death. Okay? And also the disciples lost their father figure Jesus to death, and his chair was empty at their table. The empty chairs left by death can be almost unbearable. How do we handle the pain of death as we sit and look at our mother's or our father's empty chair? The place is vacant. There is no one at the head of the table. There is no one at the right. Brothers and sisters' chairs stand mute as testimonies of a time that is no longer to be. Imagine David's grief at his son Absalom's empty chair. Ruth and Naomi's sorrow at the chairs left empty as their husbands had died. Job's ordeal as not one but 7 chairs are left empty. How does one get past the empty chair of death? John 11, verse 25 gives us the profoundly simple answer. And this is what it says. I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? The only way for us to get past the empty chair of death is to seek healing from the Word of God, realizing that grief is a process. But we who remain alive must make a choice to let God's Holy Spirit, which is the Comforter, close up those wounds, and then we can find ourselves smiling again. As for the empty chairs left by relational issues gone bad, still there is only one way out for the one who was forced out and the one who was left staring at the chair. The cure can be found in a prayer we learned as a child. Matthew 6:12 says, "And forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." So when we have fallen outs with each other, we got to learn to forgive each other and move on, because you never know when you're looking at somebody for the last time. I've seen people have bitter falling outs, swore they'd never speak to each other again, almost threatened to come to killing blows. But you got to have forgiveness, because who are we not to forgive when God has forgiven us? Both parties have to let the matter go. Esau in time forgave Jacob. Joseph forgave his brothers. But most of all, Jesus forgave us. God forgave us through his Son, Jesus Christ. How can we do less? If God forgave us through Jesus, how can we be holding grudges when Jesus has died for our faults? Can't do it. So, even in divorce cases, when we have moved on and remarried, many times we carry anger over and poison our new relationships. We have to learn to let it go. A good way to do this is by not dragging up the past at every opportunity and allowing those scars to heal. And we can do this by the power of the one that sits in a chair that is no longer empty. Our Christ Jesus sits on the right hand of God. So we got to think about this. As we said earlier, so many times the chairs in our lives are empty because of something we've said, something we've done to run somebody off. And we must learn how to curb our tongues, because when you really get down to it, most of the time family is all you got. And if you have one or two really good friends, you have been doubly blessed. So we want to work on our relationships to keep them going, because the last thing you want is an empty chair at your table where your friend or your child or your father or mother or husband or wife should be. Trust me, those are some painful times when that chair is empty and never to be filled again. So love while you got the opportunity to love. Tell somebody how you feel about them. Do something good for that person while you still on turning grounds, because when the chair is empty by death, you're not going to see them on this side again. So I would suggest that we love one another like God has loved us. And that's what we here at Generational Ministries want to leave you with from this lesson. To love each other while you still have the chance, because you may not get the chance again. So think about that and join us again here at Generational Ministries for our next short story. And as always, thank you for listening. You had a choice and you chose us, and we thank you for listening to us.